The title of this talk may appear somewhat presumptuous, but you'll have to accept that. I think we have found something rather interesting and relatively solid, given that there is a variety of welfare state designs around the OECD world, and that provides a fairly good test bed for what works and what doesn't. The reason why the government appointed a commission is, of course, that inequality has risen now over a number of years, approximately 4 decades. This has been a cause for concern, not only in Sweden, but across the whole OECD area, and also internationally in organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF, which traditionally have not bothered too much about the inequality issues. So the reason why we were given this task is that Sweden has failed in some way. Of course, the reason for failure may be sought in various corners. Given that you have an idea of what is an appropriate design, you could deviate from that design, and could be one reason for failure. But even if you have the right design, the electorate might perceive it differently. And so there may be a gap between what the welfare state delivers and what the electorate perceives to be delivered. And the third third potential gap is between the electorate and the members of parliament. Even if you have the right design, even if the electorate is convinced that it's the right design, there may be a mismatch between the preferences of the voters and the preferences of the MPs. And I'm going to scrutinize all these 3 hypotheses during my talk. But let's start with the first question: what is the appropriate design? The Nordic welfare states have been successful in the sense that we've shown in the Nordic countries that it's possible to combine a high degree of equality with sustained economic growth, a high level of education, well-developed infrastructure, competitive industries, etc. So in that respect, it's a success. But there may, of course, be different dimensions of this success, depending on what you want to stress politically, and there may be different causes, factors behind this success. What are the main achievements? Well, as I mentioned, we have accomplished high degrees of wealth in a number of dimensions. Capital, high level of education, comparatively, social capital, in everyday language, a high level of trust, and also when it comes to produced capital, physical capital, machines, buildings, etc., we are well equipped. We have infrastructure supply which is highly competitive, and one of the reasons why international investors are interested in the Nordic countries, in spite of high tax levels, for instance. So that's the first achievement. Second achievement, high levels of inequality. And as I state here, this is not to be expected. People who grew up in the Nordic countries tend to look upon equality as something given, something self-evident, and that inequality is something that deviates from a natural state of affairs. I tried to analyze that problem in a book published 6 years ago called The Anatomy of Inequality, and my aim is to prove in that book that inequality is the normal state of affairs, and that it's equality that has to be explained, not inequality. So this is an achievement. It goes against the grain of some very deep tendencies in human societies. And the same holds for trust. Trust and equality go together. There's a strong correlation both internationally and in Sweden between regions, between trust and equality. So a high level of inequality is coupled to a high level of trust, and vice versa. Of course, it's not a strictly causal relationship. You can't prove causality at that level of aggregation, but the correlation is strong, and you can make this probable by looking at a number of micro level connections where you actually can prove causality. Finally, we have a tradition of high quality government, a very low level of corruption, another reason for international investors to be interested in the Nordic countries. And that's also unnatural. If you look across the world, corruption is the normal state of affairs, and the Nordic countries are the exception, and of course a number of other OECD countries as well. But we have, to summarize, produced societies which are highly unlikely, and that calls for an explanation. I picked a few diagrams here, which is from Walter Scheidel's book, The Great Leveler, published 3 years ago, where the author looks at inequality in a very long time perspective, starting from Stone Age, going up to today's society. And Scheidel's message can be summarized in these two diagrams, actually, which confirms my statement that inequality is what's to be expected. Under normal circumstances, inequality tends to rise in a society, and the interruptions you see here are coupled to great catastrophes in human history.
Perhaps you should explain what's is a rise in inequality, what's on the different axes,
yes,
and how you measure it.
Yeah, well, the measurement is some sort of Gini coefficient. Of course, the data supply from Stone Age is sparse, but economic historians are surprisingly successful sometimes in finding indicators. If you go back to the classical age, for instance, you can look at the size of stone houses, which are still there for archaeologists to excavate, and so you get a feeling for the Gini coefficient also in those societies. So this is some sort of proxy for the inequality, and you see that under long periods inequality rises. Fall of the Roman Empire and the Justinian plague in the 4th, 5th and 6th centuries. Here is the Black Death in the mid 14th century, during which between 1/3 and half of Europe's population died. Here's the what do they call the Great Compression. I guess this is the economic crisis of the 1920s, basically. Now, for instance, if you pick Black Death, what's the reason for rising equality following the Black Death? Well, there was a shortage of labor, so the negotiation platform for the labor was strengthened vis-a-vis the feudal lords, and so real wages rose and inequality went down. The lower diagram is for Latin America, as you see, and these two are, of course, not connected during a large part of the history. They became connected during colonialism from the 16th century and onwards, but also during the early empires you have a similar mechanism. Now, my criticism of Scheidel's picture is that he missed one piece, important piece, and that's the period between 1870 and 1970, during which the countries showed economic growth and increasing equality without any violence, without any major catastrophe whatsoever. So obviously some piece is missing from his history writing. And of course that missing piece made his book very popular among right-wing thinkers and commentators. Now, what's behind this success? Environmental factors which are beyond the control of single governments, and there are institutional factors which are politically controlled. And of course, two factors behind success is the relative peace that we have experienced here in the Nordic countries. Sweden has not been involved in military operations in the Napoleonic Wars 200 years ago. Actually, we joined the Crimean War towards the end in 1856, but that did not lead to any military engagement. Denmark and Norway, of course, were occupied during the Second World War, but the death toll was limited, and the physical infrastructure was largely intact following the war. So that's obviously one beneficial factor. The second factor is relative ethnic homogeneity, which is generally speaking an asset. There's a large literature on the connection between ethnic heterogeneity and social conflict, which is worthy of one seminar in its own. I'm not going to try to summarize that literature, but under certain conditions, possible to keep conflict at bay also in a heterogeneous society. But the jury is somewhat open on that question. But we could definitely say that homogeneity is an asset. It facilitates the solution of political problems. And this does not necessarily have with race, skin color and so on. Even small differences in ethnic origins, such as Flemish Walloon population in Belgium, or the Croatians, Bosnians, and Serbs in former Yugoslavia, as you know, could end up in violent conflict in spite of rather similar origins. Now, the right column here summarizes a number of factors where there is definitely some political decision-making behind. We have traditionally strong trade unions in the Nordic countries, and as shown in the literature, Erik Bengtsson, for instance, has a survey paper on that. There is a well-established connection between strong trade unions and the wage share of the value added in society. The same goes for universal suffrage. Dana Rock summarized that paper 20 years ago. Democracies Pay Higher Wages is the title of that paper. There's also a host of publicly produced services, education, care, social security, which have been particularly well supplied in the Nordic countries, and so we are well off in that respect. The social security design has a special history, together with active labor market interventions here in Sweden, because there's a historical compromise going back to maybe the 1930s, at least the immediate post-war era, where the trade unions accepted a free trade policy in exchange for a well-developed social security system. If you opt for a free trade regime, you make yourself vulnerable, because exposing a country's economy to international competition creates a constant pressure, structural change, and a lot of people risk becoming unemployed in that process. So you have to match that with a well-developed social security system, and that was the happy compromise between the industry and the trade unions. Goes back more than half a century. We had a very active housing policy also, going back to the interwar era. I can mention the Stockholm exhibition of 1930, the rise of functionalism, modern housing, and so on. And of course, after the war, a whole system of subsidies that led to a higher supply of housing, particularly for low-income households. And of course, 100 years old, conscription. When that was actually, conscription was introduced between 1892 and 1901 in Sweden, and that decision became an argument for general suffrage. But once in place, the conscription system is a democratic factor in society. You force young people, well, males at least, to live together during a year, more or less, irrespective of their social origin and what economic background your parents may have during that period is completely irrelevant to your status within that group. So that sort of democratizing factor in society as long as it lasted. Of course, we have left that system now. We are fiddling on the margin now with a small fraction of population. Females have been admitted and so on, but this is no longer a factor of the same importance as it used to be. So all these have contributed to a high level of equality, and in order to analyze that, you need some sort of measure of inequality. I mean, what sort of inequality is important, and how come the Nordic countries have been successful in their endeavor. Well, those of you who are familiar with literature on income differences and inequality, you know that there is a strong dominance for the Gini coefficient as a measure. And I try to wage war against this Gini coefficient in our report from the Commission, because I think it's a highly problematic indicator, in the sense that you lose a lot of information when you compress a whole distribution into one single number. And to illustrate that, I have this diagram in the report where society A and B happen to have the same Gini coefficient, but they are very different. In society A, there is a minority of 40% of the population that together owns 1% of the assets. And the majority, the wealthy majority, comprising 60% of the population, owns the rest, the remaining 99%. So this is typically, say, a slave society or something like that. The B society is a more conventional, unequal society, where 99% of the population together owns 60%, and the remaining elite owns the rest, the 40%. So that would be, B would be a typical feudal society from the Middle Ages. As I said, those two societies give rise to the same Gini coefficient. And they are extremely different, of course. Incentives, social structures are totally different. You shouldn't expect these two societies to behave the same way. So too much information is lost when we use the Gini coefficient. And we have a very important test example for that in our report, where we have looked at the literature on the connections between inequality and economic growth, which is a contested issue, of course. Right-wing commentators tend to stress the need for inequality for economic growth, and that was the established truth also in economic circles till the 1990s, when some economists, among them Torsten Persson here at the Stockholm University, started to look at the empirical basis for that statement, and turned out that this was probably not true. Now at the moment there are some 30 papers on this problem in the economic literature. At least 25 of those are extremely sloppy, in the sense they have picked the Gini coefficient for the income distribution, and a few other explanatory factors, and then they correlate that and come out with a result. And they tend to give very mixed results, which you should expect, this information loss. Some are more careful, among them Federico Cingano, who was previously with the OECD, a group of economists at the IMF, and a few others. And they keep the decile groups or the quintile groups and they use in their statistical analysis. And if you do it like that, you find a very stable result, which is that the higher the share of the lower strata in the income distribution, the higher the rate of economic growth. So inequality measured this way is bad for growth, not the opposite. Okay, with a very strong result, actually. There's also a connection between equality and social mobility. And that has been established both internationally. Miles Korak, Canadian economist, showed that a number of years ago. That has recently been reproduced here in Sweden by Gunnar Brandén at the Umeå University. But there's also an analysis of Federico Cingano, which illustrates very nicely the role of the education system in this process of generating social mobility. And this is the diagram that appears in Cingano's report. What you see here is the likelihood of young people going to higher education given the education level of their parents and the general level of inequality in society. So the horizontal axis here measures the Gini coefficient of a number of OECD countries, and these three categories correspond to parents with high education, medium education, and only basic education. What you see here is an extremely clear result that the likelihood of going to higher education for children coming from highly educated families or medium educated families is totally independent of the general level of inequality in society. It's for the third group that inequality is important. And of course you shouldn't interpret this diagram causally, in the sense that if you reduce the Gini coefficient by taxes and transfers, that will in itself raise the likelihood that children with this background will go to higher education. It's more complex than that. It's rather the opposite, that if you have an educational system that provides opportunities for young people irrespective of their socioeconomic background, then you get this social mobility, and as a result of that you also get a higher level of equality in society. So the main link of causality goes that way. Equality and trust, as I said earlier, there is a strong link between the two. What's interesting here that Magnus Gustafsson and Henrik Jordahl at the Institute of Industrial Economics Research, EFN, here in Stockholm, have shown that this seems to hold all regions in Sweden. That the level of inequality affects the level of trust. Not only that, it's precisely the same type of inequality as we have already talked about, namely the share of the lower strata of total income that decides on the level of trust in society. And the fourth point here, there is also analysis by political scientists at the University of Gothenburg, a book by Christian Albrecht Larsen in Denmark, that prove, I would say, that it's the lower strata that decide on the general level of trust in society. They are overrepresented in the group of sensitive people who could opt for a low trust or a high trust attitude to other people. So to summarize, the key to success is to have a high lowest level in income, education, etc. It's not inequality or equality in general. It's this specific profile of equality that is important. And that is the main explanation for the success of the Nordic states, have achieved a high lowest level in all these important missions. So, what's gone wrong then? Now we know what should be the norms. Have we stuck to this norm or have we deviated? Well, I mean, a large part of our report is about deviations from this. We have failed in a number of respects, and I'll just go through this rapidly. These facts should be well known to most of you. Disposable income, well, this is a well-known curve for the Sweden, showing how inequality of disposable income has risen from the mid-1980s till now by about 60%. If you look at market incomes, the increase is somewhat less dramatic, particularly if you look at the last 25 years or so. In a diagram in the report, factor income or market income has had about the same Gini coefficient now for 25 years, whereas the Gini coefficient for disposable income has risen constantly. And that's important information for the government, because even if you manage to reduce inequality in market income, that's not a guarantee of success that you will also reduce the inequality of disposable income. Those are two different things, and we also can explain rather easily why there is a gap between the two. Social security, well, as I said, there is a historical compromise about this system. Since the early 1990s, mid-1990s, the public social security system has been shrinking in relative terms, as you can see from Instagram. I said there was a compromise. The trade unions have accepted a free trade regime, which is still working, you see. The export ratio of Sweden has been increasing steadily as a result of both EU integration and globalization. But the public social security system peaked here during a crisis of 1990s and then has been losing some of its position. And of course the trade unions have compensated for that by adding supplementary pensions, supplementary sick leave insurance, and so on. But that ad hoc system does not have the same effect on income distribution as the state-managed system for a number of reasons. There is a general decline in the educational system, as you all know. It's a bit difficult to analyze because we have changed so much in this system. There is a municipalization took place around 1980s. There has been a logical change of regime, I would say classical teacher-led education to what's called centered or constructivist pedagogics, and there is actually some reliable empirical literature that shows that this new regime is bad for pupils with a weak socioeconomic background. School choice, free entry has contributed to grading and segregation, and of course on top of this we had this heavy wave of immigration that added to the problems because young people are overrepresented in this group of migrants. If you look at the PISA results, which does not tell you the whole truth about the educational system, you can see here that the average result in Swedish schools is almost back to the level of the year 2000 when the PISA investigations started. But that's mainly due to the Swedish-born population, also Swedish kids with Swedish parents. Lowest curve here is for pupils who are born abroad, and they have tend to be older when they enter Swedish schools. So that's no mystery that they have greater difficulties. What's serious is this curve here in the middle. Those are kids who are born in Sweden by foreign parents, and you see there is a downward slope here. So they are producing at a lower level today than 20 years ago. And we have not managed to deliver an education system in that category. There are kids who have spent 9 years in Swedish basic education and who come out as basically illiterates at the age of 16, which is a great failure. Housing policy, well, I said there was an ambitious housing policy created after the Second World War. That was dramatically dismantled during Carl Bildt's government, 1991 to 94, the so-called Danell reform, when all these traditional subsidies basically were scrapped and it was left to the market to supply housing, and the result, as expected, has not been satisfactory for low-income households. And of course, again, the immigration wave has added problem because immigrants have a purchasing power which is not interesting to commercial housing agents, and so there's nothing surprising about the present situation. And scrapping negotiation system and admitting market rents in new will certainly not solve that problem. Finally, healthcare has so far been relatively resistant. The market is creeping into this system, and we see certain tendencies of inequality on the rise. But so far they are relatively limited. So the answer to the first question: yes, we have deviated from the norm in a number of dimensions, and that's the partial answer. Second question, how has the electorate reacted to this? Well, these two diagrams are picked from a paper by a group of researchers at the Stockholm University, Johanna Rickne, Torsten Persson, and a few others. And they show the rise of the Sweden Democrats in Swedish municipalities as a function of either inequality, which is the left diagram, Gini coefficient, or a measure which they call the share of vulnerable households. Vulnerability in the economic sense here refers to either unemployment or employment in sectors which are particularly exposed to international competition. And you see the same conclusion, that the higher the inequality, the higher the level of vulnerability, the stronger the support for the Sweden Democrats. And the gray shaded diagrams, they show previous election. These are the elections of, let's see, 2008, 12, and 16. Sorry. No, sorry. 14, 14, 10, and 6. So this was published just before the election, 2018.
Sorry, Per, can you explain the share vulnerable insider?
Yes.
What kind of index that is? That's Gini, I guess, and that's...
Yeah, that's Gini, and that's the share of the workforce that I said is either unemployed or exposed to international competition. So they work in risky sectors of the economy, and so run the risk of becoming employment that is higher than the average, although they may still have employment. So they have a fear of becoming unemployed. This was produced by economists. Here's another picture produced by political scientists. This is SOM undersökning, the SOM survey produced at the University of Gothenburg. And it shows the level of trust in the Swedish electorate as a function of your party solidarity. And you see that the general level here among the traditional parties is relatively stable, typically between 70% during most of this period, which spans 20 to 25 years. So there is some indicator of risk here among social democrats starting around 2007-2008, which is interesting. And then you have the appearance of the Sweden Democrats, who vary between 30 and 40%. So there's a distinctly lower level of trust among voters for Sweden Democrats. And the link between those two is, of course, that a number of social democrats in this have opted for the Sweden Democrats. So that raises the average level among the remaining social democrats. And this shows again that voters who feel insecure are potentially attracted by this political program. And this program, I need to stress, cultivates mistrust. I mean, that's an important part of the political agenda of that party. Mistrust in political institutions, in established parties, in the press, media generally, and so on. So this is, again, not surprising, but what may be surprising is the strength of the difference between the traditional parties and this new party. And given that party now attracts between 15 and 20% of the voters, that to me is the strongest indicator that we have seen a fall in the general level of trust in Swedish society. So that closes the second part, or the second question. We have the first question, we have deviated from the norm in a number of. The voters have responded to that as expected. greater insecurity and greater mistrust. That's not a reason for surprise. To this we can add the third problem, namely the mismatch between the electorate and the preferences of the members of parliament. This shows the preferences among voters and MPs according to party in a contested issue, namely the role of commercial agents within the welfare system. Should we permit profit maximization in schools, hospitals, etc.? And the gray staples here refer to the voters and the black ones to the MPs. And you see here the parties to the left party, the Social Democrats, and the environmental party, the Green Party, they have a very good match between the voters and their MPs. They are basically at the same level. Whereas the right-wing parties have a total mismatch between voters and the MPs. Actually, this is a bit old. That figure at 32% should be zero, because in 2015 the Sweden Democrats changed position in this on this issue following a lobbying activity from the Confederation of Swedish Industries, Svenskt Näringsliv, who persuaded, in quotation marks, the Sweden Democrats to change position. So there is now a total absence, almost, of people who are critical to this in the Swedish Parliament, whereas you can see that in the electorate at large there is a stable majority against profit maximization in the welfare sector. And there has been so for 30 years. So this is not something arbitrary or temporary, but rather a stable position among Swedish voters. Now, to summarize then, I'll try to make 4 points. First, know what's important when you design a welfare state with the particular target of maintaining a high level of equality. You should focus on the lower half of the income distribution, the distribution of education, etc. That's what counts. And the Gini coefficient is at best inefficient, at worst misleading indicator of what's going on in the distribution at large. So, given that should be the norm, what are the answers to my 3 questions? Well, we can see that all 3 answers contribute to the solution. Swedish political decision makers have deviated from this norm now during 3 decades, basically, starting in the late 1980s, and then, of course, not continuously, but on average, deviated more with every year from this norm. So there is room for suspicion and frustration among the voters. There is also such frustration, and the rise of right-wing populism is, of course, the most important indicator of this. And given this perspective, no reason for surprise. I mean, some people present the rise of Sweden Democrats as a mystery. To me, it's not a mystery. It's what should be expected. And what adds to the problem is, of course, the 4th point here, that the right-wing MPs in Swedish Parliament have opted for the extreme interpretation of what should be a liberal policy. They had drifted far to the right with respect to where they were 2-3 decades ago. And of course, could dig into the history of that sea change, but that I think is topic for another seminar, so I'll draw the line here.